On January 15, 2007, the quiet suburb of Westfield, New Jersey, was forever changed. A shocking discovery in the home of Helen Whitman, a beloved member of the community, turned what appeared to be an ordinary day into a grim turning point. A blood-soaked living room revealed the aftermath of a gruesome murder, shaking the affluent neighborhood to its core. What began as a discreet affair with her elderly neighbor would eventually expose a darker side of suburban life, as the ensuing investigation unraveled a web of secrets and lies, leaving no one untouched by the tragedy. It was a chilly Monday afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the tranquil streets. Westfield was a place where nothing seemed out of place, where neighbors exchanged pleasantries and homes exuded warmth. But on this day, something was different. The Whitman household, usually filled with light and life, stood in stark contrast to its usual charm. The curtains, often opened early in the morning by Helen Whitman herself, remained tightly drawn. Helen, known for her early rising and meticulous routine, had not yet made her presence known. This silence weighed heavily on Susan Myers, Helen's longtime neighbor and casual friend. For years, the two women had shared simple pleasures, morning coffee and conversations about their lives. But as the hours passed, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Helen Whitman was known for her meticulous nature. She lived a life of order, with every aspect carefully controlled, her home always spotless, her daily routine unwavering. But that's why Susan Myers found it strange that, by late afternoon, Helen hadn't opened her curtains or made any appearance throughout the day. By 4:30 p.m., after leaving multiple unanswered voicemails, Susan's growing concern compelled her to check on her neighbor in person. Susan approached Helen's front door, ringing the bell and calling her name, but there was only silence. She knocked louder, her unease mounting with every second of stillness. Determined to get an answer, Susan decided to walk around the side of the house, hoping to find another way to reach Helen. As she neared the living room window, Susan's heart began to pound. The curtains were drawn tightly, but there was a small gap where they didn't quite close in the middle. Her curiosity and fear merged as she cautiously peered through the narrow opening. What she saw froze her in place. The living room, once immaculate, was now a scene of chaos. Furniture lay overturned, and dark, menacing stains marred the once spotless white walls. In the middle of the room, Susan's gaze locked onto Helen's body, lying twisted and still on the floor, a pool of blood spreading beneath her head. The sight was overwhelming. Susan stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to muffle the scream threatening to escape. Her mind raced as she fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. Susan, her voice trembling, managed to tell them her neighbor was dead. The operator calmly instructed her to stay outside and wait for help. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air as police cars and an ambulance arrived, transforming the once quiet street into a scene of chaos. This moment led to uncovering what had happened before Helen Whitman's tragic death. The Whitmans were the picture of suburban success. Their home, a beautiful two-story house with a manicured lawn, was admired by everyone in the neighborhood. Inside, family photos lined the walls, reflecting a seemingly perfect life. Helen, a 32-year-old housewife, appeared to be the perfect wife, while her husband David, a successful financial advisor, provided them with comfort and security. On the outside, their life looked ideal, but appearances were deceiving. Helen spent most of her time alone, as David frequently traveled for work. Her days became routine, filled with chores like cleaning, grocery shopping, and gardening. Over the years, her marriage lost its spark, leaving her feeling increasingly isolated and unfulfilled. The loneliness weighed on her, growing stronger with each of David's trips. During one of these absences, Helen's life took a surprising turn. George Sinclair, a 69-year-old retired engineer, lived next door. He had lost his wife 5 years earlier and kept to himself, gardening and taking walks. He was well respected but quiet. One autumn afternoon, Helen struggled with heavy groceries and George happened to walk by. He offered to help, and out of gratitude, she invited him in for tea. What started as a simple act of kindness soon turned into something deeper. They spent hours talking about their lives, families, and shared feelings of loneliness. For Helen, George became someone who listened and cared in a way her husband hadn't in years. Their meetings became more frequent, and their connection grew stronger. It wasn't long before their emotional bond turned into something physical. One rainy afternoon, as they sat together, the tension between them was undeniable. Helen leaned in and kissed George. The kiss, tentative at first, quickly became passionate, driven by months of suppressed feelings. Their affair became a secret escape for Helen, filling the emptiness she felt in her marriage. For George, it was a chance to feel alive again, a rekindling of emotions he thought were long gone after his wife's death. The day after Helen's body was discovered, Detective Marie Collins arrived at the Whitman residence, beginning the investigation that would unravel the layers of this tragic story. It was just after 9 a.m. and the sun was rising higher, but the atmosphere around the house was somber. Detective Collins, a seasoned investigator with over 15 years of experience, stepped out of her car, bracing herself for what lay ahead. The crime scene had been secured overnight, and now it was time to begin the investigation. As she entered the house, the silence struck her. Helen's body lay in the living room, a carefully preserved scene of horror. Blood spatter analysis was crucial to understanding what had happened. Detective Collins took in the room broken glass, a heavy candlestick near Helen's body, overturned furniture, all signs of a violent struggle. Helen's injuries suggested she had been attacked with considerable force, and with no forced entry it seemed she knew her attacker. As the forensic team began their work, Collins moved through the house. The kitchen was spotless, and the upstairs bedrooms remained untouched. The entire incident had clearly unfolded in the living room. By early afternoon, the house was filled with police officers, crime scene investigators, and detectives gathering evidence. As Detective Collins watched them, her mind started piecing together the possibilities. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was personal. Whoever killed Helen had done so in a fit of rage. As days passed, the small town of Westfield was left in shock. The investigation continued as the police waited for answers. On January 20th, 2007, the autopsy results arrived, providing vital clues. Dr. Elaine Peters, the medical examiner, confirmed that Helen died from severe head trauma, but the weapon wasn't the candlestick as initially thought. Instead, it was a high school trophy belonging to her husband, David. The trophy had been used to deliver a fatal blow that caused a skull fracture and massive brain hemorrhage. Helen had died instantly. Defensive wounds on her arms showed she had tried to fight off her attacker, and bruises on her wrist suggested she was restrained at some point. Meanwhile, the forensic team was examining every piece of evidence. As they dusted for fingerprints and studied the blood spatter, they discovered something shocking. Fingerprints on the trophy matched George Sinclair, the neighbor. More incriminating, traces of Helen's blood were found on George's shirt, the one he wore on the day of her murder. George tried to explain the bloodstains by saying Helen had cut herself while cooking a few days earlier, and he had helped her clean up. But the amount of blood didn't match that story. Detective Collins presented the evidence to George: the fingerprints on the trophy, the blood on his shirt, and the signs of a struggle. The once calm man sat trembling, sweat forming on his forehead. He had already admitted to an affair, but now he faced much more serious accusations. Collins, calm but firm, laid out the case. "We know you were there, George. We know your relationship went beyond friendship. Your fingerprints are on the weapon that killed her. We need the truth." George's face drained of color. With a deep, shuddering breath, he finally began to speak. "I loved her," he whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." He explained that on January 15th, he had visited Helen as usual while David was away. But that day, something was different. Helen had been distant, and after George pressed her, she confessed that she wanted to end the affair. She told him that it had gone too far, that it was dangerous, and that she could no longer continue living a lie. Helen insisted that she loved her husband, despite the distance that had grown between them, and that she needed to fix her marriage. George was devastated. The thought of losing Helen, the one person who had brought light back into his life after his wife's death, was unbearable. He had pleaded with her, begged her to reconsider, but Helen was resolute. She told him it was over, and that he needed to leave. In a fit of desperation and anger, George snapped. As Helen turned her back on him to walk away, he grabbed the fireplace poker from its stand and, in a moment of blind rage, struck her on the back of the head. Helen stumbled, falling forward onto the coffee table, but George, overwhelmed by his emotions, struck her again and again until she lay still. It wasn't until he saw the blood pooling around her head that George realized what he had done. The woman he claimed to love was lying lifeless before him, and the reality of his actions hit him like a tidal wave. Panicked, George dropped the poker and fled the scene, hoping against hope that somehow no one would connect him to the crime. But now, sitting in the interrogation room, George knew there was no escaping what he had done. As Detective Collins listened to his confession, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. It was clear that George was a man who had lost control, driven by emotions he could no longer contain. But that didn't change the fact that he had committed a brutal, unforgivable crime. By the end of January, with George's confession and the mountain of evidence against him, Detective Collins had all she needed to make an arrest. On the morning of January 30th, 2007, George Sinclair was formally charged with second-degree murder. The once quiet and unassuming man was led out of his home in handcuffs, his head bowed as reporters and watched in stunned silence. The community was in shock. How could the kindly old man who had been a fixture in their neighborhood for years be capable of such a heinous act? The trial of George Sinclair became the talk of Westfield, capturing the attention of the entire town. Every day, the courtroom was packed with residents eager to hear the latest developments in the case that had shattered their quiet community. The media flocked to the small town, turning what had once been a local scandal into a story that reached far beyond the borders of Westfield. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting a strong, compelling case against George Sinclair. They painted him as a man driven by obsession and jealousy, a man who had lost control when Helen Whitman tried to end their affair. According to the prosecution, George had become infatuated with Helen, seeing her as the only light in his otherwise lonely life. When she told him it was over, he couldn't accept the rejection. The prosecution argued that this rejection sent George into a fit of rage, leading him to grab the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and strike Helen with deadly force. The evidence presented was damning. George's fingerprints were found on the candlestick, and Helen's blood was on his clothing. The prosecution also highlighted the motive, a man who had nothing left to lose, driven to the brink by the thought of losing the woman he loved. However, the defense was equally determined to prove George's innocence. They argued that the case against George was circumstantial, and that the prosecution had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that George was the killer. The defense presented an alternative theory, suggesting that George was being framed. They pointed to the possibility that someone else could have killed Helen, someone who had an even stronger motive, her husband David Whitman. David Whitman, a successful financial advisor, had been away on a business trip when Helen was murdered. He had a busy career, often traveling and spending long hours at work, which had contributed to the distance growing between him and Helen. The defense suggested that David had found out about the affair weeks before Helen's death. According to their theory, David's discovery of the affair had shattered him. He felt betrayed by the woman he had devoted his life to, and the knowledge that she had been unfaithful with their elderly neighbor filled him with anger and humiliation. In late December 2006, just weeks before Helen's death, David had confronted her about the affair. He had come across an email exchange between Helen and George, a series of messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. When David confronted Helen, it led to a heated argument. He was furious, feeling that his trust had been broken, and he threatened to divorce her. The prospect of losing her marriage, the life she had built, and the security it provided terrified Helen. She begged David not to leave, promising to end the affair immediately. David, still enraged, agreed to stay, but the tension between them remained palpable. It was this argument, the defense argued, that led Helen to end things with George on the day of her murder. But in the defense's narrative, it wasn't George who was unable to handle the rejection. It was David who couldn't let go of his anger. They suggested that after Helen's confession, David had planned his revenge. On the day of murder, he could have returned home unexpectedly, confronting Helen in a final violent confrontation. David had been out of town when the murder took place, which, according to the defense, provided him with a perfect alibi. But the defense argued that David's business trip could have been a cover, allowing him to slip away, commit the crime, and return without raising suspicion. The defense suggested that David's fingerprints could have been on the candlestick, and any traces of blood on his clothing could have been cleaned up before he was questioned. After all, as Helen's husband, he had easy access to the crime scene. Adding to the defense's theory was the fact that David hadn't contacted Helen while he was away. Normally, he would have called her at least once a day, even if just for a quick check-in. But in the days leading up to her death, David didn't call at all. The defense implied that David was still furious with Helen, refusing to speak to her as a way of punishing her for her betrayal. It wasn't until the police contacted him after Helen's body was discovered that David even knew something had happened. This, the defense suggested, was suspicious behavior for a husband who was supposedly unaware of the danger his wife was in. Throughout the trial, the defense worked to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, suggesting that David Whitman, not George Sinclair, had the strongest motive to kill Helen. They pointed to the bitter argument between the couple, David's knowledge of the affair, and his cold behavior in the days before the murder, as evidence that he could have been the one to strike the fatal blow. But the prosecution countered this narrative by emphasizing the forensic evidence linking George to the crime. They argued that George's confession, the fingerprints on the murder weapon, and the blood on his clothes were incontrovertible proof of his guilt. They also questioned why David, who had an airtight alibi, would risk everything by murdering his wife when he could have simply divorced her and walked away. As the trial progressed, the courtroom was filled with tension, the audience hanging on every word. The community, once united in their shock over Helen's death, was now divided. Some believed in George's guilt, convinced by the physical evidence and his own confession. Others couldn't ignore the possibility that David, the scorned husband, might have been capable of such a crime. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict. On March 2, 2007, George Sinclair was found guilty of second-degree murder. The evidence against him, especially the fingerprints on the murder weapon and the bloodstains on his clothing, was undeniable. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As the verdict was read, George collapsed in tears, still insisting he was innocent. The tragic end of Helen Whitman and George Sinclair's downfall serve as a painful reminder of the devastating effects of hidden desires and unchecked emotions. But this isn't the only story where foolish desires led to death. The case of a housewife's secret affair with her father-in-law is another example of how one poor decision can spiral into a tragedy.